What's going on, everyone? I am back with another vid, and this time around, I actually wanted to do something a little bit different, and that is take a look at some recent breaking news in the NFL and tie that in to the effects it'll have in this year's fantasy season. So, the news that I'm talking about is none other than the Dolphins signing of Jay Cutler. And what I want to do is kind of look at the impact of this as a whole for the team, for Cutler himself, and then for the running back Ajayi, and then for the receivers in Miami. So as far as the team goes, they come back this year from a 10-6 year, and they have high hopes. We're gonna contend for the playoffs again, and hopefully have another winning year. Unfortunately, Tannehill goes down, out for the entire year, and that puts them in a difficult situation. I think fortunately for them, however, they get a guy in Cutler that had his best year with Gase as a pro, and they're obviously hoping to recreate some of that magic. Now, whether that happens or doesn't is a whole nother issue. Personally, uh, I'm on the side of believing that it's more likely to happen than not because Cutler has that familiarity. I think he's a very situational guy, so he plays better with guys that he's comfortable with, and you saw that in Chicago with all the different coordinators he had. Also, there's talent offensively in Miami, and that's without a doubt. And on top of that, I do like the fact that Cutler tends to swing for the fences more than Tannehill does, so he'll take those shots. He'll do it time and time again. On the flip side, though, he will have those turnovers. He's not as athletic as Tannehill, so he won't be able to extend plays as long, and he'll probably have those turnovers, like I said, and give a short field for the defense of the Dolphins on the flip side of things. Now, with that being said, I would say, a 10-6 season is probably the ceiling of what the Dolphins can duplicate. I see them finishing somewhere between 8-8, 10-6. It'll take some time for Cutler to get adjusted, maybe not to the system, but just to the players themselves. And speaking of Cutler, as far as the expectations for him, fantasy wise, go, I'd say, honestly, if you were not running to the podium and selecting Tannehill, you sure as hell shouldn't be doing that for Cutler. He's going to go undrafted, and that's exactly what should happen. You know, only target him on a week where he has a good matchup and your starting guy has a bye week. Because fantasy wise, you don't want a guy that commits as many turnovers as Cutler. He has those injury issues, so for me, that's a big red flag. I would stay away from that, you know. But the cool thing is that doesn't always translate to necessarily a loss. So he might not have the best year statistically, but for you Dolphins fans out there, um, that can still result in wins for the team as a whole. Now, with that being said, let's look at the really interesting part, and that is how this affects the running game and also the passing game. Now, for Ajayi, um, honestly, when the injury came out about Tannehill, I actually thought that this benefit Ajayi because there'd be even more of a stress on the running game, and he would be uh, even more so that workhorse that they need. Now, unfortunately, I think the addition of Cutler kind of shows that uh, they're restoring that balance, and maybe even more so that they want to focus on that passing game because Cutler obviously a guy that has plenty of experience and a guy that Gase is hoping to have a big impact offensively, and the way that's going to happen is by him uh, getting the targets for the receivers on that offense. Now, also of concern is the issue Ajayi has with that concussion that was recently reported. The issue there is nobody really seems to know how serious this concussion is, so I don't know if it's going to take, a couple weeks, a month, several months to heal. And then the problem is as soon as a player has a concussion, he immediately becomes more susceptible for another one. And to go on top of that, Ajay is a very physical guy, a guy that kind of, puts his head down and just goes. And unfortunately, that doesn't bode well for him, avoiding future concussions. But still, assuming that he's healthy, I would say, last year he had almost 1,300 yards and 8 rushing touchdowns. Now, if I had to guess, I would say those rushing touchdowns probably stay in the same range, 8 to double digits. But I do think the rushing yards might take a hit. They probably are going to be a little bit higher in the beginning of the season while Cutler is still getting uh, acclimated. But then afterwards, I think they might take a hit once Cutler becomes more and more familiar with the system. So personally, that makes me demote Ajay a little bit in my rankings overall. But we'll see what happens. Uh, maybe he does prove that no matter what, that's still his team offensively now that Tannehill isn't there. On the flip side of things, looking at the receivers, I'm going to start with a guy in Kenny Stills that had a breakout year last year, and a big reason for that is the 9 touchdowns he had, uh, and this was definitely a surprise, and even more so is that he did that on 42 receptions and put together almost 750 receiving yards. Now, with that being said, you can obviously see that he is a big play guy. So he's looking at those 60, 50-yard touchdowns. And personally, I think he'll probably maintain the yardage. I'd say somewhere between 750 and 800. I think the receptions go up a little bit, maybe closer to 50. But I think the big thing is his touchdowns are going to take a dip. I think having 9 touchdowns is a hard thing to duplicate, and I probably see him with around 4 or 5 touchdowns at the end of the season. So even with that being said, though, he has a very high ceiling. So if he builds that rapport with Cutler fast, I could see him being yet again, a surprise candidate for fantasy teams out there. Now, moving on to a guy like Devante Parker. I know a lot of people have been talking about this guy as a potential breakout this year. And in large part, that comes to what he did last year. And that's almost 60 receptions and 750 receiving yards and then 4 touchdowns. Now, as far as Parker goes, he is a big guy, more of a physical guy, someone that reminds me of a Brendan Marshall that Cutler had a lot of success with. Obviously, he doesn't have as much experience as Marshall, and he still hasn't figured it out as much as Marshall had when he was with Cutler. But I would say he can probably become that number 2 guy in Miami, what they were hoping for when they drafted him, especially with Cutler there. He likes those big guys as red zone targets, also as kind of those easy, secure passes. So I would say Devante Parker probably um, going to have more touchdowns uh, in terms of receptions go, and then around 60 receptions as a whole, and between again 750 and maybe 850 receiving yards. We'll see. But the guy that I'm really interested to talk about is Jarvis Landry because, especially PPR wise, this guy is a top dude when it comes to the receivers. And if you look at last year, his stats, he almost had 95 receptions and almost, well, he had uh, 1,100 receiving yards. But the unfortunate thing is that he only had 4 touchdowns. So I do think he will have more touchdowns this year. By far, Jarvis Landry is the most dynamic player offensively for the receivers. Now, I think he is the number 1 guy. And the thing that's good about Cutler is when Cutler finds his number 1 guy, he becomes his favorite target. So Landry's got the speed, he's got the agility, he's got the hands. So I think he'll quickly become uh, Cutler's favorite guy. And I think that they can do a lot of really good things. So he won't only be a PPR guy, but I think his yardage will go up. His touchdowns will also go up. Now, I think receptions wise, he'll probably stay around the same, but we'll see. I think he will have more big plays, however. The one thing to keep an eye on though, for Landry is that recent battery charge that came out against him. We'll see. It seems like the other party isn't really uh, going after him, so that's good news. But nonetheless, a thing to keep an eye out on. And I would say, just the Miami Dolphins as a whole, it's going to be an interesting squad to keep your eye on with Cutler there. That becomes instantly a team to watch. And overall, let me know what you guys think. Was this an interesting take on the situation in the NFL? Did you enjoy this type of vid? Would you enjoy more future vids of this kind? As always, like, subscribe, and stay in tune for future videos as well.